In the days when the gleam of bronze lost its luster, the lands of the Sons of Aryaman stretched from the grassy rolling steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Pannonia. By the waning days of the Romans, some would end up as far as Iberia, and some still dwell on the eastern fringes of Europe to this day. Their origins have long been disputed, but recent genetic studies, linguistic analysis, and archaeological discoveries are helping to shed more light on the development of these mysterious people that helped shape the destiny of Europe. This is the first chapter in the glorious story of the European Iranians, the origins of the Scythians. Though the vast majority of Iranians now dwell in Central Asia, in Iran, Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, and Tajikistan, the ancient origins of their language and key elements of their culture are to be found in Eastern Europe. The Iranian languages, like many languages in Europe, are ultimately derived from Proto-Indo-European, a language developed in the eastern steppelands and forest steppe of Ukraine and Russia by at least 4000 BC. As they spread into the northwest, into what is today Belarus and the Baltic coast, mixing with the globular amphora culture, they formed a unique archaeological group known as the corded ware culture, named for their specific form of pottery. It was within this group that the branch of the Proto-Indo-European language was spoken that is ancestral to Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, Italic, and also Iranic or Iranian. Between 2900 and 2600, some tribes within the corded ware culture moved northeast into the Dvina River basin in what is now Belarus and western Russia, and quickly spread further east, all the way to the region where the Kama River flows into the Volga, near what is Kazan today. A truly huge area. The region is classified as forest steppe, and was ethnically distinct from the Yamnaya to the south. This group is archaeologically identified as the Fatyanavo-Belanovo culture. Most of their practices were a direct continuation of corded ware. They predominantly carried the male haplogroup R1a M417, and many could be further analyzed as R1a Z93, a haplogroup which is still found throughout Central Asia and among Iranian peoples today. They buried their dead in pits, frequently with grave goods such as axes and pottery. They introduced animal husbandry into the forested regions for the first time in history, and worked copper. It's likely that the roots of the Indo-Iranian language family can be traced all the way back to this population. But there would be one more interesting addition prior to the stage of the Proto-Iranians. By around 2200, a new culture had formed around the middle Volga and Kama, and spread east into the South Ural Mountains, known archaeologically as the Abashevo. Their pottery styles had changed and they started using kurgans, including with buried stone fences around them, akin to practices of the Central European bell beakers. Their metalwork also appeared to have contemporary Central European influences. A recent Russian genetic paper on the Fatyanavo and the Abashevo cultures has found strong similarities, but also some differences between these groups, concluding that though much of the Abashevo population originated with the Fatyanavo, it seems to be mixed with another population that migrated from Central Europe, with some noticeable overlap with the Unitica culture. Several of the males tested turned out to have R1b Z2103, a common haplogroup from the Bell Beaker culture in Central Europe. Lodged in the earliest stages of the Indo-Iranian development is a specific stratum from Central Europe, reinforcing the cultural continuity between East and West Indo-Europeans during the early Bronze Age. Closely following this is an explosion of slightly different but closely associated material cultures across the steppe. The Sintashta, perhaps the most famous and most advanced of these, developed on the far side of the Urals, and cannot therefore be considered European in a geographic sense. The steppe lands they inhabited acted as a belt that connected Asia and Europe into a truly Eurasian landmass. The same can be observed about the soon-to-follow Androvono culture. It's likely that an early Androvono migration south across the Hindu Kush mountains would go on to establish the Vedic culture, centered first around the Indus River. A similar movement into the southwest, into what is now Iran, led to the development of the so-called Western Iranian language branch, such as Persian, Median, Kurdish, etc. I cover the development of the modern Western Iranian population in my documentary, The Iranians. Yet those who remained on the steppe, in Europe and in Central Asia, would develop into the linguistic branch known as Eastern Iranian. And while the Sintashta and Androvono were developing throughout Central Asia, starting around 1900 BC, the Srubnaya would spread throughout the Pontic steppe in what is now Russia and Ukraine, absorbing and displacing the early catacomb culture, which had developed from the Yamnaya. The Srubnaya culture developed primarily from Abashevo, originating out of a core of the vast Abashevo regions. A recent genetic study published in Nature has demonstrated, through the most extensive genetic testing of individuals from the prehistoric Scythian region to date, that the Srubnaya and catacomb individuals formed two distinct homogeneous populations. The catacomb shared greater affinity with the earlier Yamnaya and Afanasyevo, and there was no direct matrilineal continuity between any of the samples from the two populations. While the catacomb culture overwhelmingly had dark hair and eyes, the Srubnaya had blonde, brown, or red hair, and a high propensity for blue eyes, features that would later be associated by the Greeks with the Scythians. To give you an idea of the scale, from Orenburg, Russia on the Ural River to Dnipro, Ukraine on the Dnieper is 2,000 miles, and a 24-hour drive or a 389-hour walk. The Ural River and mountains are used as a boundary of Europe and have been since the times of Herodotus. The modern city of Orenburg has a footbridge across the river that marks the point where one steps into Asia. 3,700 years ago, where Orenburg is today, the Srubnaya dwelt in scattered settlements near the river. They were very closely linked genetically to the Androvono culture to their east, though they had slightly different cultural forms. While the Srubnaya were early on named for their timber burials, it turns out that the burial style is actually rare among them, representing only a small percentage of total burials. More commonly, they were buried in unlined pits with simple grave goods. Compared to Androvono, their burials were less elaborate. They also appear to have practiced more agriculture than their eastern cousins, and were generally less mobile, though neither of these groups were nomadic at this stage. However, in the late Bronze Age, things would begin to change dramatically on the Pontic steppe that would, in the time of the earliest writings in European history, lead to the rise of the Scythians. The Persians, the Scythians, and the Medes had their roots in the Iranic branch, and based on the preserved mythology and folklore, it's a branch which shares more common elements with both Germanic and Celtic as compared to Vedic. This may be because various Iranian groups continued to dwell in Europe in close proximity with Central European Celts, Baltic, Thracians, and Eastern forest-dwelling Slavs for their entire history. Certain observed linguistic similarities between Celtic, Slavic, and Iranic have also been used in various arguments to support the theory that the Celtic language developed in Central Europe, where they would have been in direct contact with Iranian speakers, at least from the Urnfield period onward. Avestan, our earliest recorded East Iranian language, like Gaelic and Welsh, favors a VSO word order. Also, like Insular Celtic, there are some cases of initial consonant mutations or lenition in some Iranian languages. Around 1200 BC, the Srubnaya culture went into terminal decline. It was a process that wasn't exclusive to them. A climatic shift occurred around this period which affected many parts of Eurasia, including the steppes of Europe and Asia, and the Androvono-related groups were equally affected by it. A drop in average temperatures had a cascade effect, leading to less rainfall and desertification in some areas, and making any form of settled agriculture more difficult. This, coupled with existing issues such as overgrazing in their typical riverside pastures, led to unsustainable herds. The people were faced with no good options, but over time they found a way to survive. Adapting to difficult conditions, they became increasingly mobile, moving their herds across vast territories for grazing. Eventually, they would invent covered wagons, which would serve not only to transport their possessions from one stop to another, but as mobile homes. Though it is now believed they did not become 100% nomadic as a whole, much of the population moved from season to season as they were forced to switch pasture areas. Some of the most western-dwelling Srubnaya went further west still, where they encountered Urnfield-derived people. They appear to have influenced the Gava culture, who inhabited a wide area in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and western Ukraine. Their burial style and material culture show influences from the Pontic steppe. The Srubnaya-derived cultures were likely the vector for the spread of chariot technology from the steppe to the Proto-Celts. As the Srubnaya culture collapsed, pressures were coming from the east. In the eastern Ural reaches of the Srubnaya emerged the Mezhovskaya culture. Genetic studies have shown that they were predominantly derived from the Srubnaya, but were mixing with East Asian-like groups, with about a 23% admixture. Even further to the east, some Androvono-related groups had mixed to some extent not only with the Bactrian-Margian archaeological complex, but various Northeast and East Asians. One of the large groups to emerge from this process was the Karasuk culture. One of the localisms developed was a unique style of animal art. As some of these Karasuk-related tribes of mixed Asian and European ancestry moved west, the style began to spread rapidly, until it eventually developed into the much-famed Scythian style. Many historians had assumed that the Scythians of the Pontic steppe emerged from a westward migration of these mixed Central Asian nomadic groups. A recent definitive study on the matter has provided results that shake the old consensus to the ground. While between the Bronze Age and Iron Age, the groups on the Pontic steppe would indeed receive some migration, very little of that was East Asian. On average, Scythians only possessed a 5 to 10% North or East Asian admixture. Depending on the specific group, they also had very low amounts of Iranian Neolithic admixture, which was picked up by the late Androvono culture. The animal art and the culture of the steppe nomads, born at the beginning of the Iron Age, were largely spread through cultural and economic connections between peoples across the steppe, facilitated by their shared Proto-Iranian heritage and necessary adaptation to natural conditions, not primarily through population movements from east to west. The Scythian population of the Pontic steppe, though made up of divergent genetic groups, most closely group with the modern populations in the Baltics and northwestern Russia. The vast majority of their ancestry came from Eastern Europe. By 900 BC, riding across the vast steppe lands of southern Ukraine upon fine leather saddles, as the waters of the dawn sparkled like their gleaming scale armor in the first rays of the rising sun, were those known to ancient history as the Scythians. Archaeologically speaking, the famous Cimmerians are indistinguishable from Scythians. They had adapted the same sort of material culture, religious traditions, and a similar lifestyle to many Iranian groups on the steppe during the early Iron Age. Possibly they corresponded to one of the diverse Scythian-related steppe-dwelling groups identified in the genetic studies, though which one is impossible to say. They almost certainly spoke the same language, and for all intents and purposes, they were Scythians. The differences between them were likely political. Many of the rivers in Ukraine and southwestern Russia, the heartland of the Scythians, have Iranian names. The Don River, for instance, is from Dan, a word for water in the Scythian language. The Dnieper's name is from Scythian Dan Apar, meaning either far river or deep river, while the Dnestr means near river. Mount Elbrus in the North Caucasus of Russia is derived from the Iranian Alborz, ultimately from Proto-Iranian Hara Barzati, meaning the high watchpost. The name appears in Zoroastrian texts as the holy mountain at the center of the cosmos and the home of the god Mithra. Offshoots of the early Scythian culture may have spread west into the plains of Hungary, where they would come into direct and long-lasting contact with the Hallstatt Celts. The Danube would serve as the border between the Hallstatt Celts and the Scythian-associated groups until the La Tène period. The exchange between Celts and Iranians had a significant cultural impact that reverberates to this day across the whole world. Trousers. Prior to the strong Iranian influence on the Celts, no other groups were wearing trousers in Europe or perhaps anywhere in the world. Elites of the Hallstatt culture were unquestionably impressed. They started wearing Iranian trousers, built chariots modeled after Iranian examples, took great influence from their art, and the burial customs within the central Hallstatt culture also changed. Instead of the cremations practiced by the Urnfield culture, the elites started burying themselves in ceremonial wagons, being drawn by horses, in imitation of the Scythian style. Despite decades of modern historians insisting on an eastern origin of the Scythians, a massive genetic study of the Scythians now demonstrates conclusively that though they had diverse origins, which are hard to pin down, that diversity arose primarily from the merger of various earlier European steppe populations. They were quite distinct genetically from the later cultures on the eastern steppe, such as the Saka. Even the most closely related group, the Sarmatians, still appear to have distinct genetic origins from the Scythians. The Scythians themselves had their own origin story, which Herodotus recorded. The historian's ethnographic information about the Scythians is largely reliable, as he appears to have been very familiar with their language and may have visited the area. The Scythians said that they were descendants of Targitaos, the first man, who is a son of the sky god that Herodotus identified with Zeus, and the river goddess of the Boisthenes. the ancient Greek name for the Dnieper. Targetaos then had 3 sons with the so-called snake-legged goddess, likely representing a chthonic goddess of the land. While the 3 ruled the land, the 3 great treasures fell from the sky: a plow and a yoke, a battle axe, and a drinking cup. The holy gold refused to be touched by any but the youngest son, who then became the High King and began the branch of the royal Scythians, who were believed to rule over all the other Scythian tribes. The social organization presented in the myth has shared concepts in Gaelic mythology, where the 3 sacred treasures of the gods are divided between them, as well as a system of high kingship, where one divine king held at least religiously derived authority over all the other tribes of the ethnos. The plow and yoke represent the productive farming and cattle breeding class. The drinking cup represents the priestly class, who performed libations and prepares the homa drink, and the battle axe, the warrior aristocracy. That the High King takes possession of all of these symbols shows him to stand above these class distinctions. The Scythian origin myth shows that they believe themselves to be an autochthonous population, with their origins localized specifically to the Dnieper, emphasizing that they did not believe themselves to be Eastern migrants. The sacred golden implements, including a plow, also agrees with recent archaeological studies that show the Scythians were not in fact truly nomadic, but likewise had at least some agriculture. Herodotus tells of some of these Scythian-related groups that did engage in agricultural activity. He also tells of a myth about the so-called wandering Scythians, which he says he tends to believe more than the autochthonous story. But where this account comes from, he does not say. And it's this account that later historians would largely rely upon in their theories of an Eastern origin. However, it is not the account that the Scythians themselves believed, and it's likely a Greek intellectual speculation, as the Greeks of this period prided themselves on being highly rational and often rejected mythological explanations, replacing them with equally invented stories, but ones that they felt were more rational. Now, we know more about the Scythian culture and society than we do about almost any other European group during the same period, because they lived in such close proximity to Greeks, closer even than many realize, and not just beside the Black Sea. It is with the Cimmerians that the Eastern European Iranians first break into the historical record in a big way. Their name probably comes from the Scythian language Gaia Mira, meaning a union of tribes, and appears in Neo-Assyrian Akkadian as Gimiria, in Babylonian as Gimiri, and Hebrew as Gomer. This last would have a notable impact on the medieval Christian European worldview and the origin myths which will be the subject of a future program. Sargon II boasted in an inscription, "I beat the Cimmerians, a people who did not know fear. I put their hordes to flight." This appears to refer to battles that took place in Urartu, occupying parts of present-day Armenia, eastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran, confirming later accounts of Cimmerian invasion into the region by the later Greek historian Herodotus. However, even earlier than these Babylonian references to Cimmerians may be found in the words of the Greek poet Homer. In Book 11 of the Odyssey it says, "She came to deep-flowing Okeanos that bound the earth, where is the land and city of the Cimmerians, wrapped in mist and cloud. Never does the bright sun look down on them with his rays, either when he mounts to starry heaven or when he turns again to earth from heaven. But baneful night is spread over wretched mortals. Thither we came and beached our ship, and took out the sheep, and ourselves went beside the stream of Okeanos, until we came to the place of which Kirka had told us." This has some interesting implications on the geographic conception of the world, according to Homer. It could be that he knew only that the Cimmerians lived far away, where there was less sun. However, it could also suggest that the land of the underworld was believed to be in the north, as it was thought in Celtic tradition. The sunlight was less in the north, and stories of the perpetual darkness or light of the far north had spread to the Greek world. At least as of the 7th century BC, Greeks were establishing settlements throughout the Black Sea, and they would have had knowledge of the region prior to deciding to establish settlements there. Yet this is arguably not the only reference to the Cimmerians or other Scythian-related groups by Homer. In the Iliad, the poet says, "Now Zeus, when he had brought the Trojans and Hector to the ships, left the combatants there to have toil and woe unceasingly, but himself turned away his bright eyes, and looked afar upon the land of the Thracian horsemen, and of the Mysians that fight in close combat, and of the lordly Hippomolgi that drink the milk of mares." The name Hippomolgi means horse milker in Greek. The poet puts them in association with the Thracians, strongly suggesting that he is speaking of peoples in the near vicinity of them, which was of course the North Black Sea region, where we know that peoples who milked mares were living at the time. This means that Iranian groups were some of the first mentioned Europeans in all of history. By the 8th century BC, the Cimmerians had become venerable masters of iron and knew the riddles of steel. In the 8th century, the Cimmerians would take the dark passes through the frigid Caucasus and sweep over the Middle Eastern nations like a spring flood running wildly off the mountains. By 720 BC at the latest, some Cimmerians had moved into what is now part of Georgia and were engaged in fighting with the powerful kingdom of Urartu. In reports sent to King Sargon II of Assyria between 720 and 714, the Urartian king Rusa and his troops marched north to attack the land of the Cimmerians, likely meaning their settlements in Georgia, but were dealt a serious defeat and were forced to retreat. The Cimmerians followed up by launching their own extensive raiding campaign, pillaging the kingdom for several years, and effectively establishing themselves as the main power in the South Caucasus. By 714, they could already extend themselves as far south as Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran. The later Greek histories of this expansion into Western Asia by the Cimmerians claims that they were being driven out of their lands by the Scythians. There is no evidence which supports this, but given that the two populations are indistinguishable archaeologically, such political divisions and rivalries can't be ruled out. But if their goal was only survival, it seems strange that they would flee the Scythians straight into powers like Urartu and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The true motivation was likely plunder and conquest. By 709, fear of the Cimmerians was sweeping like wildfire across Anatolia and south into Mesopotamia. The Phrygian king Midas, fearing that the Cimmerians would overrun his kingdom, sought out the Assyrians to form an anti-Cimmerian alliance, but the offer appears to have been declined. By 680 BC, the Cimmerians split into two. The majority went into Anatolia, while a smaller group remained on the Iranian plateau. In Anatolia, they destroyed the Phrygian Empire, sacked its capital, and King Midas committed suicide. They started to settle down and establish control over the region by 670, even started to become sedentary, building their own settled communities and giving up the nomadic lifestyle. Despite suffering a defeat at the hands of the Assyrians which killed the Cimmerian king Tupsa, they had set themselves up as the largest power in Anatolia by 660. They tried to gain control over the Lydians, but when that proved difficult, they turned their attention southeast towards the Neo-Assyrians. It appears that for a time, the Cimmerians even gained control over much of the Levant, thus explaining why they become mentioned in the Torah and become part of prophecy. In 657, the chief royal Assyrian astrologer was reported to have used the title King of the Universe for the Cimmerian king rather than the Assyrian king. And in the 640s, they were invading the Greek city-states on the Anatolian coast, such as Troad, Iolia, and Ionia, and destroyed the original Greek temple of Artemis at Ephesus. However, their constant expansionist drive would eventually wear them out. By 635, the Cimmerians, already significantly weakened, were destroyed by the oncoming Scythians. Their people were likely absorbed by the victorious Steppe clan, or they were otherwise absorbed into native populations of the region. It was likely this entry into Asia by the Scythians, which would lead to the later Greek tales of the Scythians having driven the Cimmerians from Europe. The Scythians refer specifically to those people who dwelt north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus during the early to mid-Iron Age. These were the people who historically called themselves Scythians. Groups on the Central and East Asian steppe like the Saka had many similarities and shared customs and artistic styles, but they were not Scythians. This includes the Sarmatians, who at the very same time were dwelling east of the Volga River, though they were the closest to being Scythians, as Herodotus reports that they spoke the Scythian language, but strangely, recognizing the dialectical divergence between them, probably already significant, as Herodotus feels the need to explain it, included with a lengthy myth about why they are different. If these differences existed between two neighboring groups, the differences between the Scythians and those on the far eastern steppe would have been far greater, which may be why Zoroastrianism never spread west into the European Iranian communities, who maintained their own unreformed folk religion. Herodotus gives a fairly clear description of their geography. Above the mart of the Dnieper River, which is situated in the very center of the whole sea coast of Scythia, the first people who inhabit the land are called the Callipydae, a Greco-Scythian race. Next to them, as you go inland, dwell the people called the Alazonians. These two nations in other respects resemble the Scythians in their usages, but sow and eat corn, also onions, garlic, lentils, and millet. Beyond the Alazonians reside the Scythian cultivators, who grow corn not for their own use, but for sale. Across the Dnieper, the first country after you leave the coast is Hilea. Above this dwell the Scythian husbandmen, whom the Greeks lived near, the Hippanes called the Dnieperites, while they themselves Olbiopolites. These husbandmen extend eastward a distance of 3 days' journey to a river bearing the name of Panticapes, while northward the country is theirs for 11 days' sail up the course of the Dnieper. Crossing the Panticapes and proceeding eastward of the husbandmen, we come upon the wandering Scythians, who neither plow nor sow. Their country, and the whole of this region except for Hilea, is quite bare of trees. They extend toward the east a distance of 14 days' journey, occupying a tract which reaches to the river Gerhus. On the opposite side of the Gerhus is the Royal District, as it is called. Here dwells the largest and bravest of the Scythian tribes, which looks upon all the other tribes in the light of slaves. Its country reaches on the south to Tarika, on the east to the trench dug by the sons of the blind slaves, the mart upon the Maeotian swamp, called the Kremni, and in part to the Tanais. When one crosses the Tanais, one is no longer in Scythia. The first region on crossing is that of the Saromatai. Most of these various groups which Herodotus identified have been shown to have slightly different genetic origins. One, the Budinoi, is thought to relate to a group identified in a recent genetic study in the Middle Dnieper, which closely genetically groups with populations in the Baltic region. Possibly, these were an early Proto-Balto-Slavic population that had moved southeast long before the more widespread dispersal of the Proto-Slavs. They were dwelling between and among various Scythian groups, seemingly coexisting in much the way the Greeks did. Thus, the Scythians occupied much of what is south and central Ukraine and parts of southwestern Russia, at least at the time of Herodotus. At least some of them lived in covered wagons, so that they could move along with their herds, though they also established large fortified settlements. The Belsk Hill Fort, located near the Vorskla River, directly west of Kharkov and south of Sumy, had palisade walls, ditches, and ramparts, 32 kilometers or 20 miles in circumference. They built rectangular houses with basements, which appear to be a continuation of the earlier Srubnaya-style architecture. They were not therefore strictly nomadic, but the mobile lifestyle of some was rooted in a particular economic and military tradition. This is also reasserted when Herodotus explains a Scythian custom of allotting land to one that they believed was ritually doomed. To a true nomad, allotting land would have been pure nonsense. The Scythians, as their myths and culture attest, were rooted to the Pontic region. Unlike the later Sarmatians to their east, the Scythians had a highly patriarchal society. While some Eastern Iranian groups, likely under the influence of Northeast Asians, began tattooing themselves, there is also little evidence that the true Scythians of the Pontic steppe carried on this custom. Herodotus makes no mention of the practice, and only later sources who begin to conflate Eastern and Western Iranians refer to them as being tattooed. They did, however, engage in ritual inhalation of cannabis. They also had a custom concerning what might be now called transgenderism. Herodotus linked this condition to a curse inflicted upon them by the celestial Aphrodite, whose temple they plundered in Ascalon when they were pillaging the Middle East. Those who were so afflicted by what they considered a disease were called the Anares, which means unmanly in Scythian. Like the Celts, Herodotus reports that they collected the heads of their fallen foes. They scalped them also, and used these scalps to wipe their hands, hung them from their horses, or even made cloaks of many of them sewn together. Sometimes leather was made of the skin of the slain enemies, which they made their quivers out of, or even made banners out of entire flayed skin. Another brutal practice was the funeral of the king, which Herodotus describes in detail. While some had earlier believed it to be a fictional account, archaeological studies of Scythian burial sites largely align with his description of mass human and horse sacrifices, and with riders buried around the tomb. Some evidence for physical conditions related to a monastic celibate lifestyle have been detected in some of the recent studies. It was also found that Scythians lacked genes which led to negative side effects from drinking alcohol, meaning that a Scythian would be very unlikely to get a hangover and would be less susceptible to becoming overly drunk. Perhaps as a result, they drank copious amounts. Starting shortly after the Cimmerians, the Scythians would emerge into the history of the Middle Eastern world in dramatic fashion. According to Herodotus, they passed not through Georgia, but took the longer route of going along the Caspian Sea, through what is now Azerbaijan. Possibly around 680, they entered the southern Caucasus, taking advantage of the chaotic political situation in the region to conduct raids. By 762, their position had become powerful enough that the Scythian king Partatua married the daughter of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. The marriage would have been part of an alliance between the Scythians and the Assyrians. The son of Partatua, Madies, would lead the Scythians to their greatest victories in the region. As the Median army was besieging Nineveh, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Scythian army set upon them unexpectedly, wiping them out, and reportedly gaining power over all of Media and much of the region due to their stunning victory. They pillaged as far as Palestine, where they were met by the Egyptian pharaoh, Psamtik I, who gave them gifts in exchange for halting their attacks. Though Herodotus claims that they ruled the Medians for 28 years, and their leaders were eventually poisoned to death by the Medes, more likely is that after a raiding spree, they were gradually reduced in power, and the survivors returned to the steppe, though they would continue to engage in occasional raiding excursions. In the late 600s BC, the focus of Scythian military adventurism would turn decidedly westward. They moved heavily into the Pannonian steppe, and south along the coast of the Black Sea into what is now Moldova, Romania, and Bulgaria, acting as a significant influence upon the Thracians, who would adopt many of their fashions. They continued influencing and likely to some extent fighting the Celts in Central Europe, but it was the Lusatian culture of Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and northwestern Ukraine which would bear the brunt of their attacks. A number of Lusatian settlements have been excavated that contain Scythian arrowheads lodged in the walls, with the high probability that the settlement itself was sacked and destroyed by the Scythians. Quite possibly the downfall of the Lusatian culture in the 5th century BC was as a result, at least in part, by Scythian raids. This puts the Scythian activity much further into Central Europe than perhaps many people realize, potentially with Scythian raids as far as what is now eastern Germany. However, the Scythians were not without their own military challenges during this period. Greeks had shifted focus to the Black Sea for acquiring grain after the Persian capture of Egypt, and extensive alliances were made between Greek states and the Scythians. This close relationship culminated in a strange situation where Scythians were not only used to supplement Greek armies, but were actually the police force of the city of Athens. This was the butt of many Athenian jokes and appears in plays and art. Likely, this was in part due to Athenian elites not wanting or perhaps not trusting locals to police other locals. A foreign mercenary force can at times be more depended on to police a population because they have less sympathy with them. And Acharsis, known in Greek tradition to have been a wise man from the Scythians living around the 6th century BC, was turned into a legendary figure and often included as one of the 7 sages of Greece. However, this growth of Greek power in the Pontic region would not go unnoticed. The rising might of Persia had set its sights on Europe, and under Darius I, in around 513, they attempted to subdue the Scythians and capture the northern coast of the Black Sea. It was a region rich in agriculture, and with increasingly wealthy Greek trading cities. According to the account by Herodotus, Darius constructed a bridge out of boats across the Bosphorus to march his troops into Thrace. He turned north along the Black Sea coast, going through what is now Bulgaria, where they crossed the Danube Delta and entered Scythian lands. However, the Scythians, being mobile warriors, conducted a scorched earth tactic, perhaps the first in European history. They fell back before the oncoming enemy, but burned all crops and poisoned the wells, so that the advancing forces had nothing to take or forage to sustain themselves. They likewise engaged in hit-and-run attacks and sought to disrupt the supply lines. After a few months of taking losses and unable to engage the Scythians, Darius retreated back across the Danube. How much truth there is to this account is uncertain, as the Persian accounts claim Darius gained a massive victory over the Scythians. But it is a plausible tactic that they could have used for success against even a much larger, more menacing force. Yet by the 5th century, the Persians were not the only power pressuring the Scythians. To their east, other Iranian groups appear to have begun making a westward push. The Sarmatians, themselves likely being driven by the Saka, were putting increasing pressure on the Scythians. Until sometime before the 5th century account of Herodotus, they had successfully dislodged Scythian control from regions east of the Don. This in turn put increasing pressure on the Scythians to move further west, and their battles with the Thracians, Celts, and Lusatians would increase. Tensions would also increase with the Greek colonists. While up to the 5th century, numerous colonies existed without any defensive walls, and with little evidence of widespread violence. Walls begin to be erected, smaller outlying settlements were destroyed, and remains from graveyards have been found with Scythian arrows lodged in them. Scythian political power was established over Greek colonies on the north coast of the Black Sea, and coins begin being minted bearing the names of Scythian kings. Crimea becomes an increasing focus of their activity. However, this period lasted less than 100 years, after which time good relations appear to have been re-established between the Greeks and Scythians, and many more Greek settlements were established. Throughout the 4th century BC, the Scythian culture and art reached its full bloom. Thousands of Scythian monuments were created, and the wealthiest burials likewise date to this time. They were still burying their honored dead in great mounds. The Scythian elite were adopting many elements of Greek art and culture, even as they retained their distinctive style. Their influence was expanding in Central Europe, and their ties to the Greek world were strong. They had established themselves as far as the Pannonian Steppe, the South Danube, and Azerbaijan. Yet it is exactly in this period that they would come head-to-head with their biggest challenge yet. A great king led the Scythians during the 4th century Renaissance, Attaius, unifying all the Scythian tribes from the Don to the Danube. He sought to expand Scythian power further south and west, coming into conflict with the Thracians. Attaius was, according to Herodotus, trying to get the Scythians to abandon their mobile pastoralism and develop more sophisticated towns and economies. This wasn't just legendary Greek storytelling. Archaeological studies have shown agricultural production in Scythian regions grew by 600% in the late 5th and early 4th century. Kamianka Dniprovska, located in what was a hotspot during the first years of the Russian-Ukrainian War, is thought to have been developed as an important Scythian political capital at the time, likely showing the importance of the Dnieper to the Scythians culturally and economically. Though the Scythians had good relations, possibly even an alliance with the Macedonians, King Philip II began to recognize the Scythians as a growing threat to Macedonian ambitions. In 339 BC, Philip II led an army north across the Danube and did battle with the Scythians. King Attaius, who was reported to have been 90 years old at the time, still rode with his men into the battle. He died in the fighting, and the Scythians were routed. Philip took 20,000 Scythian women and children as slaves and plundered the wealth of their people. A decline in Scythian power appears to correspond to this defeat. But it didn't happen overnight. In 331 BC, Zopyrion, a general of Alexander the Great, tried to take control of the Pontic steppe, besieging the city of Olbia, near modern Edessa. However, the Scythians held out and turned the battle against the Macedonians, routing them and killing Zopyrion in the battle. However, increasingly Greeks and Thracians extended their power along the Black Sea, reducing Scythian control. By the 3rd century BC, Scythian control seems to have nearly disappeared. Military defeats, the encroachment of the Sarmatians from the east, the influence of the Greeks around the Black Sea, and likely the movement of the Proto-Slavs and Germanic people from the north and northwest, and a breakdown of leadership, all contributed to the dramatic and swift decline of the Scythians. On the South Dnieper, where they believed themselves to have been born, they gradually faded away into the darkness of history. In Crimea, a kingdom identifying itself as Scythian continued on for a time, as did a smaller outpost near the Danube, both referred to as Scythia Minor. They were conquered by the Pontic king Mithridates VI between 1010 and 1007 BC, and were gradually absorbed into the subsequent populations, disappearing as an independent people. Yet the Iranian presence in Europe would not end with their demise. They would be replaced by the Sarmatians, a people with a shared origin and similar language, who would carve out their own place in history. From the Bronze Age horse masters, the mare milkers marked out a marvelous chapter in the history of Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the world. Though they left us over 2,000 years ago, their unique culture, their fighting spirit, and their wondrous art have left a captivating mark upon world history that continues to inspire people today. Yet, for all that, they did not completely vanish into the aether. Genetic studies have now shown that their male and female lines may still be found among those of Eastern European origin to this day. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can become a member of the channel on YouTube, where you can access these videos ad-free. You can also find the ad-free version on Patreon. You can follow me on Facebook or X. Big thanks to all of my supporters, and as always, stand tall.